You're standing in your kitchen at 8 p.m. The day's been long. Meetings, emails, decisions stacking up like dirty dishes. Someone asks what you want for dinner. You open your mouth, and nothing comes out. You've made 1,000 decisions today, and now picking between pasta and leftovers feels impossible. Your brain has simply stopped cooperating. We've all been there. For 20 years, psychology had a beautiful explanation for this feeling. They called it ego depletion, and it turned out to be one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of the field. The story begins in a psychology lab in 1998. 2 plates of food. One contained fresh-baked chocolate chip cookies, the other, radishes. And what happened next would reshape how we think about willpower. Participants were asked to resist the cookies and eat only the radishes. Then they tackled an impossible puzzle. The cookie resistors gave up nearly twice as fast. Something had been used up. Roy Baumeister called this ego depletion, the idea that self-control draws from a limited pool. Use it up on one task and you've got less for the next. It was elegant, intuitive, and wildly influential. The theory spread fast. Within a decade, ego depletion was taught in introductory psychology courses everywhere. It appeared in self-help books, management seminars, even courtroom arguments about crimes committed under mental fatigue. The glucose hypothesis made it even more compelling. Researchers suggested that acts of self-control literally consumed blood sugar, the brain, burning through its fuel supply. And here's where it got really interesting. Studies suggested that drinking lemonade, actual sugar, not artificial sweetener, could restore depleted willpower. A glass of sweetened lemonade became psychology's unlikely productivity hack. The model was beautiful in its simplicity. Willpower works like a muscle. Use it and it gets tired. Rest it or fuel it and it recovers. Finally, science had explained why diets fail at night and decisions get worse as the day wears on. But science doesn't stay still. And in the early 2010s, a movement was growing, one that would shake psychology to its foundations. They called it the replication crisis. Researchers across the world began systematically retesting psychology's greatest hits, famous findings that had been cited thousands of times. And when they looked at ego depletion, the results were devastating. In 2016, a massive multi-lab replication attempt involving 23 laboratories failed to reproduce the ego depletion effect. The original findings couldn't be confirmed. The beautiful theory was cracking. The glucose hypothesis fell even harder. Subsequent research showed that rinsing your mouth with sugar water without swallowing produced similar effects. You didn't need to consume glucose, you just needed to taste it. Something else was going on. Something not about fuel or depletion at all. And that's when researchers started asking a different question entirely. What if willpower depletion isn't about biology? What if it's about belief? Enter the mindset model. Psychologists discovered something remarkable. Whether you experience ego depletion depends heavily on whether you believe willpower is limited in the first place. People who believed willpower could be depleted. They showed the classic depletion pattern. But those who believed willpower was unlimited, they just kept going. Same tasks, different beliefs, opposite outcomes. This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because it suggests that ego depletion might be real, but psychologically real, not biologically real. A self-fulfilling prophecy built into our expectations about our own limitations. A 2024 review in Science Direct put it bluntly, the simple resource-based strength model, the idea of willpower as depletable fuel, is now considered, at best, an oversimplification, at worst, simply wrong. The Global Council for Behavioral Science went further, quote, "The idea of a finite pool of willpower energy that is literally consumed like fuel is no longer a tenable scientific position," end quote. 2 decades of advice. Reconsidered. But wait, before we throw out the entire concept, there's a complication. Decision fatigue. Because even if ego depletion is oversimplified, mental exhaustion is clearly real. We've all felt it. The question is, What's actually happening? A 2025 study in Frontiers in Cognition found something subtle but important. Basic perception remains stable under cognitive load, but higher-order functions, understanding, prediction, complex reasoning, decline significantly over demanding tasks. In other words, something does get worse with prolonged mental effort. But it's not willpower in general, it's specific cognitive functions. And the decline isn't about running out of fuel, it's about how we allocate attention. So maybe depletion isn't about energy, maybe it's about motivation. After hours of demanding work, your brain doesn't run out of gas. It starts asking whether this effort is still worth it. Here's where it gets practical. According to NASA research, 80% of aviation accidents occur due to human errors in decision-making during uncertain circumstances. Decision quality matters. The mechanism behind it is still being debated. And yet, and this is important, a 2025 study in Nature Communication Psychology using large-scale healthcare data found no credible evidence for decision fatigue in medical professionals making repeated complex judgments throughout their shifts. The evidence is genuinely mixed. Some studies find decision fatigue effects, others find nothing at all. What explains the difference? This is where the mindset research becomes crucial. When people believe mental effort is depleting, they show depletion patterns. When they believe effort is energizing, they don't. The experience is real, but what creates it may be more about expectation than physiology. Think about what this means. For 20 years, millions of people were taught that their willpower was a limited resource that would inevitably run out. That belief itself may have been creating the very exhaustion it claimed to explain. It's a strange loop. The theory becomes the cause of the phenomenon it describes. Tell someone they're limited, and they start experiencing limitations. The question becomes, what happens when you tell them something different? So here's what the research actually suggests, and it's not about drinking more lemonade. First, consider questioning the belief that you're out of willpower. That belief itself might be shaping your experience. Instead of reaching for sugar when you feel mentally fatigued, try reframing the task. Research suggests that viewing effort as energizing rather than draining may actually change how you experience it. That said, timing still matters. You might want to schedule important decisions for times when you feel mentally sharp, but recognize that your beliefs about that timing may matter as much as the timing itself. The controversy isn't fully settled. Some researchers argue ego depletion is real but weaker than originally claimed. Others contend it's entirely an artifact of belief and experimental design. The debate continues in the journals. But here's what we can say with confidence, the simple story. Willpower as depletable fuel that can be replenished with sugar. That story no longer holds up to scientific scrutiny. What remains is more interesting and more empowering. Your experience of mental exhaustion is real, but the cause may not be what you think, and that opens up possibilities. Be skeptical of pop psychology advice based on the original ego depletion model. The willpower as muscle metaphor sold a lot of books, but much of it rests on research that hasn't replicated. This is what makes the ego depletion story valuable. Not the theory itself, but what its collapse teaches us. Science is supposed to be self-correcting. Sometimes that correction is painful. Thousands of studies built on ego depletion assumptions. Entire self-help industries. Court cases that cited mental exhaustion as mitigating factors. All of it resting on findings that couldn't survive replication. And yet, here's the thing, even knowing what we now know, you'll probably still feel exhausted after a day of difficult decisions. That experience doesn't go away just because we've updated the theory behind it. The question isn't whether mental fatigue is real. It is. The question is, what's causing it? And more importantly, what can you do about it? The research points toward mindset interventions. Not toxic positivity, not pretending you're not tired, but examining whether the stories you tell yourself about your limitations are creating those very limitations. Try an experiment. Next time you feel mentally depleted, notice the thought, "I'm out of willpower." Then ask, is that an observation or a prediction? The difference might surprise you. Because here's what the mindset research actually shows: the belief comes first. People who expect to be depleted experience depletion. People who expect to stay strong often do. The expectation shapes the experience. This isn't just positive thinking. The neurological research suggests that belief states actually change how the brain allocates resources. What you expect to happen influences what your brain prepares for. The ego depletion story is ultimately about something bigger than willpower. It's about how theories shape reality. We don't just describe human behavior, we influence it by how we describe it. Tell an entire culture that willpower is limited, and you create a culture that experiences limited willpower. The theory doesn't just describe, it prescribes. It teaches people what to expect from themselves. If you're finding value in this kind of exploration, hit subscribe. We cover these questions every week, the research behind how we think, decide, and sometimes fool ourselves. The replication crisis, for all its disruption, gave us something valuable. It forced psychology to look more carefully at what it actually knows versus what it assumed it knew. That's progress, even when it's uncomfortable. And ego depletion isn't dead, it's evolving. The resource model may be oversimplified, but the underlying questions remain fascinating. Why do we sometimes run out of steam? What actually restores us? Current research suggests the answer involves motivation, attention, and belief, not a simple fuel tank that empties and refills. The new models are less elegant, but they might actually be true. So where does this leave you, standing in your kitchen at 8 p.m., unable to decide on dinner? Your experience is real. You're not imagining it. The exhaustion is genuine. But the story you tell about that exhaustion, whether you're depleted beyond recovery or just temporarily tired, that story isn't neutral. It shapes what happens next. Maybe you can't decide on dinner right now. That's fine, but consider this. One possibility is that your willpower tank is empty. The other is that you've been telling yourself a story about empty tanks for so long, you forgot there might not be a tank at all. The willpower myth isn't just about willpower. It's about how we understand ourselves, and how that understanding creates the very experiences we're trying to explain. What you believe about your limits shapes those limits. That's not mysticism, it's what the research actually shows, and knowing that, well, it changes everything. Or at least it can. I'm glad you stayed with me through this one. The psychology of willpower turned out to be more complicated and more interesting than anyone expected. Until next time,